Hello and welcome to the This Is Not Therapy Hour. I am Brandon Tessers. I am a licensed therapist, but this is not therapy for very, very many reasons. Right now, I'm just pouring some tea, so I'm slightly off camera. Uh, this is not therapy. It is just an open conversation. I'm here, going to be here for the next hour. I'm going to be talking about whatever I'm talking about. Uh, I'm here to talk with you all. It's like, open office hours kind of thing. Uh, and so I'm doing my best to make my guesses about who you are and what you're interested in and how I'm coming across to you, how I'm impacting you. For any of you who are willing and able to participate in the chat, I appreciate that because it gives me a lot more information on which to base those guesses about who you are and what you're interested in and so forth. Um, this is a public stream on the internet, obviously, as you know, because you're here. That's one of the many things about it that makes it not therapy. So I will do my best to read out comments as they come in because we're live streaming on 3 different platforms simultaneously, and each person will only see the chat, the things that are entered into chat from the stream, the platform that you're watching from. So if you're on Twitch, you'll only see Twitch chat stuff and so on. So I try to reach it out so that we're all on the same page. I work with a private therapy practice called Effective Artistry. Our office is located in Northbrook, Illinois. We do individual, group, couples, and family therapy with people in the states of Illinois and Wisconsin. We also work with some coaches who can work with people all over the world via the internet. All of the coaches we work with are executive functioning coaches. That's our particular specialty as a practice. But each of them also has their additional specialties as well. We have parent coaching and business and professional coaching and creativity and artist coaching. Yeah, we've been gone for the last 2 weeks. Unfortunately, I hate to miss this stream at all. I try to be here every week, but I especially hate to miss it 2 weeks in a row. Put up a clock here so that I can keep an eye on the time. I apologize for that. To any of you who were trying to join us 2 weeks ago or last week. 2 weeks ago, we had just a couple different meetings come up and canceled. And last Monday, I woke up without much of a voice, had a cold over the weekend. As you can maybe hear, any of you who come here regularly might be able to tell that my voice is a little different than usual. Even still, I'm fully recovered from being sick, but for some reason, at least sometimes when I get a cold, I'll lose my voice, and then the voice doesn't come back all the way for like a week after the cold goes away. So not quite 100%. I think it has something to do with me like continuing to talk a lot even while I'm sick or have sinus pressure and whatever going on, or maybe not drinking enough, or who knows. But I'm here, and I forgot to say this in starting off that like if you're willing and able to jump in the chat, please do so. Don't hesitate. I'm going to start by talking about whatever it is that I'm talking about. I think it's better to just get going and start talking about something. As much as I'm tempted sometimes, and this is one of those times where I'm tempted to just be like, well, I got a lot to do, so let me just kind of work while I'm on camera. And if anybody wants anything, hit me up in the chat. I think that's harder for people to come in on and just see somebody sitting here silently and like think, oh yeah, I'll put something out there. I don't want anybody to worry about like interrupting me. So I'm going to talk about whatever I'm talking about. But please don't like constrain yourself in terms of what you're putting in the chat, right? If I'm talking about something and you have a thought or a question or a comment about something that you think of as unrelated, don't hold back, put it out there. Don't worry about like taking us down a rabbit hole or anything. I'm here for you, first of all, to talk about whatever you're interested in talking about. But beyond that, that's just how conversations work. It's this idea of like, we stick on one topic and don't move from one thing to the other. Really depends a lot on what you consider to be like the same topic. A concept that I was thinking about earlier today that I haven't talked about with people as much recently, but used to come up quite often, is the concept of granularity. And that's kind of what I'm referencing here with what we consider to be the same topic. Granularity is just if you have some amount of something and you've separated it into like 10 different chunks, that's less granular than if you separated that same pile of stuff into 100 different categories. So The more you distinguish the categories from one another, the more granular your concept has become of it. Uh, so when we're talking about a topic, right, like we could say a topic of conversation is sports. And we're talking about football, we're talking about basketball and baseball and swimming and ice skating and whatever. And if we're considering the topic there to be sports, all of that would be on topic, right? But if we were to become more granular and say, rather than the topic being about sports, the topic is about football. Now, if somebody's talking about basketball, now we'd say it's off topic. If we get even more granular and say that the conversation thus far isn't about football, it's specifically about the NFL, and talking about college football is different, or about a particular team, or even a particular player, or a particular game or moment or play, you know, I can talk about like that time that Caleb Williams threw that pass in the overtime against the Packers or whatever. Depending on whether we call that, we can say the topic is sports, we can say it's that play, we can say it's football, and that's going to dictate whether we think what comes next is on topic or off topic. This is one of the many concepts that messes with a lot of the ways that we're taught to navigate these kinds of things. That, for example, in this particular case, we're generally taught that like you should avoid trying to change the topic or taking people off of down a rabbit hole or on a side tangent or whatever, right? You should try to contribute to the conversation or at least not derail it, which is understandable advice. And I wouldn't even say necessarily like bad thing to keep in mind. Certainly in some cases, it's actually quite helpful and important, especially when there's like larger group conversations or like structured formal meetings where you're trying to address a particular thing or where there's some kind of an agenda to the conversation. That kind of stuff not only doesn't really matter though when it comes to individual like one-on-one conversation or casual conversation, it actually like actively inhibits communication if we're trying not to take people off topic. So that's part of the reason I make that point here, is that this is not a meeting with an agenda where we've got to like address point A. Until we've addressed point A, we can't wrap up or move on, So then anything which isn't about A, let's table that for later. This is just a conversation where we're going whatever. So in that case, we want whatever comes up in a person's mind to come up. But even aside from the fact that sometimes it's beneficial, even if we are in a situation in which like we can agree it's, it would be bad to take things off topic, and there's still this second thing of, well, what exactly are we quantifying as the topic? How closely do we need to hew to what's already been said before it counts as being in a different category? This kind of like nuance rarely matters. There's a lot of these kinds of things, especially in the work that I do, and these topics that we all tend to focus on in the conversations that we have here. There's a lot of this stuff where we're talking about things which are like very nuanced, very granular, very precise, very specific. And for the most part, that stuff doesn't matter until and unless it does, right? And that's the nature of the work that I do as a therapist. And when I've done coaching or when I do presentations, I'm a problem solver. That's my role. People are experiencing something that they want to be different, meaning either, like we've talked about in the past, either what I refer to as a negative aim, where it's like there's something happening that I would like to happen less or not happen at all, or a positive aim where there's something that I want to happen that's either not currently happening at all, or whatever extent it's happening, I want it to happen more. Either way, you want your experience to be different. Well, these things that like the majority of the time don't matter, in the rare occasions on which they do matter, that's when it's important to go look at like that level of nuance and complexity. And that's what we're here for, right? Is it reductive to say like good versus evil? Yeah, of course. But for the most part, that doesn't really actually have a practical impact in any person's like day-to-day life or the function of any particular situation, right? That we can say something like it's bad to kill people, and that's uncontroversial, and the vast majority of the time is not going to interfere or cause any problems for anybody. Then there are weird edge cases that are very rare, like man, I shouldn't have picked that example. Let me pick a different example because it's hard to think of edge cases. It's hard. I can think of edge cases for that other one, but it's hard to think of any that are like not controversial. So let me pick something else. Let's see. Okay, here's one. We can say like it's bad to eat something which has fermented, which is rotted. Now this one would be a one too, because I'm not like an expert on cooking and stuff. And to me, fermenting and rotting, like those are the same thing, but they're probably different now that I think about it. Let me say it differently. It's bad to eat something which has like turned, has gone, like gone sour, gone bad, like it's beyond ripe. And as a general rule, that's like a good rule. We don't need to clarify, like, actually, some things are even better if you do it in a certain specific way, right? But then there's specifics where it's like, okay, well, if you like kimchi or if you like, I don't know, I think some kinds of coleslaw. Again, I should have picked a different example. Alcohol is something that is fermented. Pu'er tea. Where there are some like very niche, as a general rule, if you walk through your life with the idea that like once a food item is old enough or has been, preserved improperly or not at all or whatever, that the taste and the smell has shifted towards like a sense of, it smells rotten. If you walk through life with a rule that like don't eat that stuff, you're gonna be good. Like that's not going to cause you problems. If you walk through life with a rule of like 50-50 coin flip on eating that stuff, it's probably going to cause you problems. But if you do certain things in certain specific ways, there are versions of it where it's like, actually, this is going to do even better for you if you do this, right? So same here with the kinds of things that we're talking about. I'll take, let's say, get stuff done right away so that you don't have to worry about it later. It's a very common, like, you should get things done as soon as you can get them done. It's a very common understanding. And for the most part, if you walk through your life going by that, like, that's not going to cause you problems for the most part, because we have processes in place and environmental things that kind of help us to determine, like when is it a good time or the best time to start working on something. But there are times where people get the wrong idea about like, I should be working on this thing as soon as possible. And it's actually not something that works best that way. Whenever someone comes across that, problems start to arise because their understanding, the way they're going about doing it, doesn't actually match what's on the table. And that's something where this work might come in. We're not contradicting the idea that it is oftentimes beneficial to do things as early as you possibly can, or even depending on how you phrase it, we wouldn't even necessarily contradict the idea that you should always do things as soon as you can. But in that case, we got to be clear about like, what does it make that makes some time as soon as you can do that thing. But we're talking about situations in which like that is not the best way to move forward on something. You shouldn't let people treat you poorly is also like really great advice. Of course, it relies a lot on what exactly is it that we're calling poor treatment. If we go into something like you shouldn't let people yell at you, again, I would say as general rule, that's good advice, right? If somebody's yelling at you, don't spend a lot of time with them. Does that cover every edge case? No, there are exceptions to that. And when and if somebody gets into that point where it's an edge case that's an exception to that, if they're living by that general understanding, that's where a problem is caused. So when we're talking about like nuance and complexity and like tiny little details and stuff, we're getting real precise. We're not saying that's how everybody should approach this stuff all the time. Like here's a good example of that, where people will say like, you should be authentic in your communication, vulnerable, whatever. Are those desirable things? Certainly, or at least they're valuable things and they're very desirable in the proper context. Is that like generic advice of how you should interact with all people all the time? No. I make it my policy to challenge anyone who treats me poorly to a duel. That's I like that. Honestly, dueling, like the formalized like duel to redress grievances, right? You have wronged me in some way, and now I'm challenging you to some kind of formalized violent altercation is genuinely one of the like most baffling things to me that we as a species did that at all. And of course, it was never like nearly as widespread as we probably think of it as being. Um, and we can there's a lot of information and clarity around like what are the things that happened that led to a place where this is what people were doing, but it's still there's there's a particular phrase that we use a lot where we say I can't understand why anyone would blank, and that phrase always has been bothersome to me because I know that what we're saying when we say that is like I could never envision a scenario in which I would do that or I would think it was anything but a terrible idea. uh, but it also technically is conveying like I can't understand what would bring a person or what circumstances would have to occur in order for a person to get there. So I can understand how people got there, but in the other sense of like I can't imagine what circumstances wouldn't be necessary for me to ever think it was anything but a terrible idea. I cannot understand it. Based on my reading of the Count of Monte Cristo, duels were a constant problem. Yeah, my personal favorite fictional duel is from the very short-lived series Firefly. I just think it's a funny one. I mean, duels, as with a lot of like stylized violence in art, I'm going to say, this is a hot take, are awesome, or at least can be. Like I'm a big fan of action movies. I abhor violence in real life, and I understand that there's some difficulty in the connection between like thinking that stylized and artistic representation of violence can be cool or interesting or artful, impactful, whatever, while also saying like, well, then we've glorified it and now people think it's cool and that influences people, and I get that and that's a problem. But I have to be honest, there's some like fight scenes that are super cool. It's just like there are any forms of choreographed movement. You know, there's a lot of choreographed dance that is really cool. It's one of the reasons I'm not a big sports guy. I know I use that. I've referenced those kinds of things a lot in these conversations, partly because it's a relatively safe hobby that to be aware or to make a guess that people are aware of it, even if they don't particularly personally engage in it. And partly because a lot of the time what I'm trying to do is equate internal or cognitive or emotional things to observable and physical things. And so sports is a good reference there. Uh, that's a good dual scene. The other one in Firefly, I'm guessing. It makes sense to me if the idea is I can either try to assassinate each other in the street and get civilians involved, or we can set a time and place. Yeah, that does make sense. Of course, then we got to explore like why are people in a situation in which they feel as though those are the only two options. But yes, and also that's not like. Well, I was going to say that's not the majority of it, but I guess it could be if what we're saying is like if you've insulted me or socially harmed me or damaged me or attacked me in a grievous enough way, then I'm going to have to assassinate you. So we might as well set a time and place for it. Anytime I'm watching a Marvel fight scene, I'm cringing at all the property damage. That does get to me sometimes. I kind of consider that, especially anything taking place in a street with cars. Yeah. So dangerous. Yeah, I agree. And I think that that's part of what makes like a particular action sequence or fight scene like well done or not is the extent to which there's a term called the suspension of disbelief, which is in reference to like when people are engaging with art, they agree to suspend their disbelief, right? Like by acknowledging that like this is a movie, this is a play, this is a pantomime, or whatever it is that we're about to observe. This is a book, this is whatever. Part of what we're doing when we say that is, and therefore I am not going to evaluate it as though someone was presenting this to me like it was real, right? Like if somebody told me about like, hey, this thing happened to my uncle, he was a Jedi and whatever, I'd be like, nope, that's not real. What are you talking? Immediate rejection. And so when we do that, that means that we can't like access and get value out of the narrative because we're just assessing whether it's like real or not real. So this suspension of disbelief is part of the contract, the unspoken social contract that the audience enters into. But the artist's side of that contract is to make it as easy as possible for the audience to be able to suspend that disbelief. So we're saying for the duration of this, I am suspending the processes which would normally be like, is this believable or not believable? Is this real or not real? I'm suspending that until the end of this. But there's all kinds of things that the artist can do that makes it jarring and pulls me out of that, right? Like I don't want to get back into that. I've engaged in the art hoping to be able to engage with the narrative or whatever and not be like, well, that doesn't seem very realistic. But if you do certain things, then it's going to pull us out of it, right? And then someone crashes through a building and I'm worried about the pedestrians on the street below. So yeah, that is one. And I have seen like certain YouTube videos that will address this sometimes, that I agree that's a big part of it, that if you film your action sequence in such a way where it's like random civilians are getting harmed, unless that's what you're trying to do, because some action movies they want to make a point about like the damage that's being done to innocent bystanders or whatever. But if that's not what you're trying to do, if you're a Marvel movie and you're just trying to like make a cool story, I shouldn't have said it that dismissively. I don't mean it like make a cool story, but generally there are exceptions. But generally in Marvel movies are not trying to like draw the audience's attention to like, hey, violence is a terrible thing that results in all kinds of innocent people being killed and their lives being ruined. Sometimes they do. And they do it well, I think, at least sometimes. But but if you do it that way, then that like takes you out of it. Because all of a sudden it's like, we're watching people fly around and shoot laser beams and generally like look very cool. And then all of a sudden it's like, oh, whoa, they just smashed that car full of random people. Like, kind of makes it hard to think of them as the good guy anymore. Insurance plans must be hellish in Marvel NYC. Yeah. I would imagine. See, the fun thing is, one of the things that I do like, and I can understand why people are anti-Marvel movies. I truly can, and I'm not trying to like call anybody out for having that opinion. But I think they're entirely valid forms of art. It's worth discussing all these things anyway. But one of the things I like about the Marvel Cinematic Universe, we're used to it now, these connected things. But it allows them to follow up on stuff. So, for example, the first Marvel Spider-Man movie, Spider-Man Homecoming, actually the second one also, Far From Home, both of those movies are things that like follow up on the consequences of something that happened in a different movie, right? That some of the major characters in the first Spider-Man movie are people who their job was to like clean up a bunch of the wreckage, or at least help in the cleanup of a bunch of the wreckage that happened when the aliens attacked New York at the end of the first Avengers movie. And they get to explore that kind of stuff. It seems like they've particularly used Spider-Man for that, which makes a lot of sense to me, because Spider-Man we're just going to do like, this is what we're going to do right now. We're just doing like straight up analysis of superheroes in Marvel comics and movies. Spider-Man has always filled an interesting role because he's a street level hero. So in Marvel comics or whatever, there are ways people sometimes divide up the different heroes to like the different levels that those heroes operate on. Like Marvel well enough, haven't kept up with it since after the first Black Panther movie. my wife and I used to watch all of it as it came out, and then 2020 and COVID, uh, I watched WandaVision, and then I've basically watched nothing since then. That's the last time I was caught up. Even though there's many of those movies that I would like to see, like the second Black Panther movie for sure. Because one of the downsides of the MCU, and this doesn't have to be this way, but it is for a lot of people, including me. I'm a person that like when it comes to narratives, if I'm told that like I don't want to start reading the third book in an 8 book series, even if I know that people will say like, well, the third book is where it really like starts to get good. And even if it's written in such a way where like any of the important things that happened in the first couple books you are reminded of in the third book and whatever, I like to go and do it from the beginning. And so that makes it hard when I fall behind on the MCU because during COVID, we also had 3 young kids. We just like weren't keeping up on it. And then now it's like whenever I think about it, it's like, well, I got to go back and watch this. And then it just gets overwhelming. But anyway, yeah, they sometimes people will divide it up and talk about street level heroes like Spider-Man or the Defenders, like Jessica Jones and Daredevil, where they're focused on villains and plots and storylines that affect like their local neighborhoods, their local cities, right? And then there's like world level stuff like the Avengers, and then there's galaxy level heroes that are talking about stuff that's like galaxy ruining or whatever. But Spider-Man has always been this interesting one. I think because he's such like a common self-insert character for so many people that he's like, especially for people who tend to be comic fans. Still haven't seen Civil War. Not convinced I would enjoy it, but I generally don't have a lot of patience for infighting. So I liked Civil War. I do think that there's a skill to being able to explore like interesting or relevant and even heavy themes without making something feel feel heavy or feel lectury. And I think Marvel does this well sometimes. And Civil War, I think, is a good example of that, where there's like good and interesting themes, like there's some real tension and thought-provoking stuff that is explored. And certainly it's explored in a way that like you don't have to notice or pay attention to any of that stuff and can just enjoy the movie for what it is on the surface level too. But this, so more broadly than superheroes, I am a big fan of what's often called genre fiction. So for me, especially sci-fi and fantasy are the 2 big ones, but horror, historical fiction, romance often get thrown into this. Genre fiction often just means anything that isn't what would otherwise be called literary fiction, which is like stuff that's set in our contemporary world, right? I'm a big fan of that stuff for a lot of reasons. I know that there are stereotypes, and there are stereotypes for reasons. There are trends. There are correlations between people liking that kind of stuff and other things, and it's something that I find interesting, those correlations, and have explored. But one of the reasons that I love genre fiction is because it allows the artist, whether it's a writer or a director or whatever. What? You're a sci-fi fantasy fan? I never knew. Right. The funny thing is, like most of the time when I meet people, they would be, because I know enough about everything to like talk to anybody about whatever the things are that they're interested in. So most of the time when I'm talking to people, they're not sci-fi fantasy fan. Well, I guess I shouldn't say most of the time, but often I'm talking to people that aren't sci-fi and fantasy fans. And so we're talking about other things, whatever. And we can talk about stigma and what things have changed, but certainly there's still to some extent a stereotype about like nerds and nerdiness and whatever that I like. There's no qualification for what a nerd is that I don't meet, right? Like I've played nerdier games and watched nerdier movies and read nerdier things than most nerds have. And I have a level of knowledge about that stuff that is beyond what most nerds have. But I also then when I'm like out and about socially or whatever, don't present in the ways that people would expect nerds to. And so they can be surprised when it's like, yeah, no, I can talk in depth about, I don't know, a dozen different trading card games. Wow, nerd flex. I mean, I can flex some nerd stuff, but this is the problem with me doing this solo is I'm not taking pauses to sip my tea. So I've just been holding it here for half an hour. It's cooling down. My brother once, my brothers are big board gamers. Like in the board game community, they go to board game convention every year. And I like board games, and my whole family likes board games. I play a lot with them and whatever. And my brother once was like, yeah, I met somebody that was like, hey, you like board games? I like board games. And I don't just mean like the normal stuff, you know, whatever. This is what the other person was saying to my brother. My brother was like, awesome, like very excited to have met somebody else who's like into board gaming. And then the person was like, yeah, I play like, you know, Settlers of Catan, which to someone in the board game community, that would be kind of like someone being like, oh no, I'm a film guy, you know, like I don't just like the films that everybody likes, you know, like I like The Matrix, you know, something like that, where it's like, no, that's hugely popular. Settlers, wow, basic, yeah. I've been playing online Spirit Island every Monday with my family these days. Oh, I don't know that one. But my brother said this story with like such disdain. He was like so disappointed. But it's true that like to most people, if you play Settlers of Catan, that's like, oh, or like Ticket to Ride, you know, like, oh, you're a board game nerd. Even though those are like, wait, you don't know Spirit Island? I don't know Spirit Island. Highly recommend. Make a note. I mostly, not mostly, I entirely explore board games passively. It's just the ones that my brothers and other family members introduced me to. It's a board gamer's board game. See, I generally wouldn't even call myself a board gamer, even though, yes, I know a lot of them and whatever. And I can talk about the whatever. I like them, and I even like doing critique and design. You know, we've designed some board game stuff. I play around with some of that stuff. But I approach board games as I do any other art. It's an art. And so it's not just a matter of like, let's see. So something like, let's take comics, for example. We were talking about comics earlier. Comics, they come along or become more popular as an art form. It's a collaborative game where you play spirits trying to murder colonists enough that they get scared off your island. That sounds interesting. The spirits all have great names like Shadow Flickers Like Flame. That's funny. I like that. And there you go. A great example of what I was eventually going to get around to with board games is like, because people look at board games and they think of it as a game, they access it as a game, you know, their schema for what a game is and a board game is. And that's very focused on like gameplay, you know, rules. What do you do on your turn? What are the victory conditions? And of course, that is what makes a game, right? Of course, there are like, just like there's in any art form, there are things that deliberately play with the medium and reject certain like tropes or rules or expectations about the form. But generally speaking, a game, yes, it's going to have rules and it's going to have victory conditions or some kind of completion criteria. But that's not generally like what people talk about. That's in the same way that like when people go and see a movie, they don't come back and talk about like the cinematography or the lighting or whatever. That there's an experience that's created by any art. That's part of what art is that it's an audience member engages with the art and has an experience of the art. And so board games, video games are similar in this regard, that like a lot of that is it's set up in such a way that each individual who engages with it has their own experience of it. But that's where I approach when I'm looking at games and talking about games that I enjoy or don't enjoy, is like, what is the experience of it? I like it mostly because you focus largely on your own board, but if you want to win, you have to work together strategically with the other players. Interesting. And yeah, there are some games that are like a somewhat derogatory criticism that will get thrown about for some board games is that it's like multiplayer solitaire, that there's like no interaction with the other players. You're basically playing your own game, and then at the end of it, you compare results with everybody else who's also playing their own game. Also because it's just really well made, very complicated to learn at first, but very fun once you get into it. Yeah, that's part of so rule sets being more intuitive and easier to grasp the first time around is certainly a plus, except for if that's not what you're going for, right? Sometimes you want Gloomhaven is, again, a very, well, I was going to say very popular and well known, but like among game people, that's one of the most famous over the last 5 or 10 years. But the whole thing there is it's all about complexity. Same with something like Twilight Imperium or, I don't know. Trying to think of games that are like known to be very complex and heavy. Well, whatever. Games like that, where like that's part of what the experience that people are looking for. It's like, I want to play some very detailed, like it's going to take a long time, very very thorough rule set kind of thing. Because everything and board gamers will, like the ones who are in the community, they talk about it like it's an art too. They'll acknowledge this, that like everything from like the title of the game, the what is portrayed on the box, the how it feels to have things in your hands. I've met Twilight Imperium people who have never heard of Gloomhaven. It kind of baffles me. Well, different, Twilight Imperium is heavily complex, but competitive and like meant to be played. I was going to say meant to be played in a single sitting, and I don't know how true that is necessarily. It takes like 6 hours. I've never played it myself, but it takes like 6 hours at minimum to play. So I think people split it up, but it's, an individual game of Twilight Imperium. You play it through and it ends, where Gloomhaven is a legacy type game. So like what happens in one game session then impacts future game sessions. Gloomhaven, I think, is really fascinating because it's really, there are a lot of like video games, like RPG video games, especially like party-based, turn-based RPG or tactics kind of based games that built off of things that were originally in like miniatures gaming or wargaming, stuff that started with like physical things and then take those concepts and build them into video games. And then Gloomhaven does that again in reverse, where it's like, Gloomhaven is effectively trying to replicate the experience of playing like a game of Final Fantasy or Baldur's Gate 3 or something like that, but in a board game, which is an incredibly complicated thing to try and do. And so that's just hilarious to me that like the whole point was in making those things video games was adding a lot of things that the computer can handle on the back end. So you don't have to, for example, set up a different map, that is just generated for you. And then now they turned it back into a video game where it's like, nope, now you got to set up this different map every time. And it's cool, but very different kinds of games for sure. Also, there is an interesting level of like sci-fi people not liking fantasy or fantasy people not liking sci-fi, an identity kind of thing where it's like, no, I'm a sci-fi guy, I don't like fantasy, or I'm a fantasy guy, I don't like sci-fi, which is also interesting to me. Of course, I don't like horror, but that's not because of like the genre or like cultures around it. It's because I don't like being scared by art. But yeah, like, my brother, both my brothers, but one of them in particular is like huge in the board game community. And actually, this is a better way to say it. Roger Ebert, the famous film critic, his philosophy on critique was always that he judges films based on like how well they accomplish what they're trying to accomplish, right? So that, of course, he might like this movie versus that movie, or think that this movie is more serious or has deeper themes or is more generally artistic or aesthetically pleasing than this other movie. But he wouldn't rate that as being a better movie than this other movie. It's about how much do they accomplish what they're trying to accomplish, which as far as I'm concerned, is what all critics should be doing. To me, the role of a critic is to help the audience find the art that they're looking for, not to be to sit in judgment of whether art is valuable or good in some broad or definitive sense, right? That the point of a critic is like, I want to read a book. There's so many books to choose from. Which one should I? The value of having someone in the role of a critic is to be like, well, here are some that might be interesting to you. And so that should be done through the lens of like, what are you looking for? What are you trying to experience? If you want like a fun, slick action movie that's just, very visually oriented, like not a lot of depth and whatever to character drama or deeper themes or whatever, but just really great, cool action. Like, for example, Mad Max Fury Road, I know, is one that gets talked about as being really good at that. There are some like Mad Max Fury Road that's really great, and there are some like the one that's popping in my mind is X versus Sever, which is just awful. Either way, they're both attempting to do the same thing. One just does it really well, and one does not. I kind of feel like if you specifically only like one of sci-fi or fantasy, then what you really like is probably a very specific section of the genre and haven't had much of the other. Like, I understand Ursula K. Le Guin is sci-fi, but reading her works, can you really say that's not fantasy at all? Honestly, man, see, I like having these kinds of nuanced and detailed conversations about things that are very niche and like most people don't care about. But yes, what exactly distinguishes between science fiction and fantasy? That's something that made a lot more sense 100 years ago. Not quite 100 years ago, but like early to mid 20th century than it does anymore. Because science fiction, when it first was becoming like a larger genre, and I'm referencing like the 1940s, 1950s. I know that there was stuff earlier than that, but I'm thinking of like Isaac Asimov and Ray Bradbury and Arthur C. Clarke, like when it started to become more widespread. A lot of that was fiction that utilized scientific principles. So that's where that like idea of science fiction came from, kind of like historical fiction, right? Where historical fiction, as opposed to fantasy, right? If you're writing a book about people who are sailing around and using swords, like that could be fantasy, that could be historical fiction, depending. What makes it historical fiction is that you are using actual like information about Earth history, like real actual history that has happened, to build your story on top of, right? That you're going to be, you can take some diversions away from the reality, but by and large, you're operating under the spectrum of like, or not spectrum, operating under the general rule set of history. So unless otherwise noted, everything in this follows with what happened or would have happened in real history. Science fiction was like that too. It was like, unless otherwise noted, we are abiding to the best of our ability to the best of our knowledge by real scientific principles. And then, of course, in both of those, right, like you then want to explore other things that don't follow what we know to be true. And that doesn't necessarily get you out of the genre. I forget who it is. I heard of some sci-fi author having a rule that like you can, like the best way to write sci-fi is to limit yourself to 3 rule breaks. Like if you're going to have aliens, because, lots of interesting and valid stories to be told in science fiction that involve having like other life forms, but that's not how we know real life to be or whatever. So that's one. Or faster than light travel or whatever. Yeah, you can compare like sword and sorcery with like space opera. Right, like I've heard, and again, this is a relatively well-known argument among certain circles. Star Wars is fantasy, 100%. Star Wars is not science fiction at all. It's just, so most people look at science fiction and fantasy and just look at the like aesthetics, and that's how they do. You got lasers and stuff, then you're sci-fi. If you've got like magic and swords and whatever, then that's fantasy, which is fine. Again, it's like we were talking about at the beginning. None of these conversations are about like people are wrong for thinking that way. That's a useful way of going about and separating things. But then if you really want to like get into it and try and figure out how to divide things up, which for the most part you don't need to do, but there are times and places where it's useful to do, um, especially if you're on the professional end, right, where you're talking about like publishing or doing critique or selling books and stories and stuff. Like knowing how to frame it and who to sell it to and how to say like this might be of interest to you becomes more important. Um, because if you get into that, then like the Force is magic. Clearly it's magic, and lightsabers are swords, and you know, they're not inhibited by the speed of light in their travel. And do you feel like you're in Magic 1430 or Magic 4030? Oh man, that's a reference I don't know, or maybe it's not a reference and I'm just not understanding. Or is it like course levels that you're saying? Like Magic 101? What's the 1430 and 4030 references? But yeah, like years, like in the year 1430, 1430, or the year 4030, difference between sci-fi and fantasy. I get you. Yeah, I mean, my favorite genre fiction is fiction that like, sorry, yes, years, cool. Is fiction that sets and then follows its own rules. Back to like that suspension of disbelief. So there's a phrase that was really huge in like Hollywood and TV and stuff. I don't know, 10 years ago, especially a noisy premise. If you think back to like the 2010s era of TV, everything had a very noisy premise, meaning that like the premise that sets the show up is really out there. It requires that the audience be willing to accept a lot right off the bat. You got to be like, I'm on board with, okay, aliens have invaded Earth and they're, in control, but there's an underground resistance fighting against them. Cool, or whatever. Or these are sleeper Russian agents posed as an American couple who, on board. Or this woman does damage control stuff for politicians or whatever, and she's having an affair with the president of the United States. Like these are big things to accept, but they put it right in the premise, right on the tin. Like this is what you're in for. You sign up for this part, right? Because then audience can get on board with that, right? Or like Game of Thrones has a very noisy premise, and you don't want to change it later on, though, right? Like if you're watching your show, if you're watching Law and Order, it's a police procedural story of the week kind of a thing, and then halfway through the episode now there's aliens involved, then it's like, no, that's bad. Even though I'm happy to watch a show with aliens involved, you're not following the premise that you established for what I signed up for, right? That's part of why people like to categorize between sci-fi and fantasy. Is for some people, if they're reading about swords and sorcery, whatever, and then somebody pulls out a machine gun, it's like, whoa, that's not, but you ruined it, right? This is not just true for like the premise or the content, but also for conventions. So like a common convention is breaking the fourth wall. So like the show Fleabag was famous for doing that, but the mockumentaries from like the aughts kind of, they break the fourth wall, but they get around it in a way by doing interviews. George R.R. Martin had to let the audience know the White Walkers were real early on, or readers would not be down for it when they're suddenly actually real. Right. If you're setting up this world that's like, this is very gritty, very realistic, whatever, and then 3 books in, all of a sudden magic happened, it feels like a cop-out. You're like, no, this is breaking the rules that you set up for yourself. So especially in genre fiction, sometimes people will be very explicit about the rules that they set up for how it goes. This is how magic works or whatever. And I like that stuff a lot. A big part of what I like about genre fiction is that I was starting to say, it gives the artist extra levers to pull, right? It gives you additional things to be able to mess with, to emphasize or de-emphasize particular points or themes, or Terry Pratchett is one of my favorites. He's a satirist who writes in the genre would be called fantasy, even though I think the more relevant descriptor is that it is satire. And he can have a book in order to make points about like the way in which our world uses money, our currency system, whatever. He can write a book about a person who's inventing the system of currency and money in the world in which, so that he can emphasize and explore things in certain exaggerated ways. Right? Star Trek famously, again, I keep saying famously, this is famous among certain circles. Like most people don't know it, but if you pay attention, most people who pay attention at all know it. Star Trek famously, the original Star Trek series was very much like most sci-fi was back then, an attempt to like emphasize and make some point or explore something about our real life by being able to exaggerate characteristics of things, right? That if you're wanting to look at, for example, the dynamics of racism in your culture, well, having different like alien species is a different way to be able to kind of exaggerate and emphasize and explore things in ways that people will access differently, right? That somebody who is very much pro separation of races in real life can read a book about different alien species and how some are being mistreated and be like, that's a bunch of nonsense. That's terrible that they're being treated like that, because it's not parsed as being the real thing. It's like writing a mystery novel when the big reveal is based on something the reader could not possibly have known. Have you heard of the Discworld RPG? I have not heard of that. I'm not surprised that there is one. Like every major franchise has RPGs these days, but I have not. It would be interesting. Sometimes things like that, like Deadpool is an example where when people are doing like a pastiche where they're lovingly mocking a certain genre or a certain form or whatever from within it, like when that's well executed, it's so great. And it also seems to be so rarely well executed. The person I know is playing in a Discworld one shot at a convention soon. Interesting. Because that's the thing, like Discworld, so back to the board game thing, it's about the experience. Love Terry Pratchett. Yeah, great. Art is about the experience, right? And so Discworld certainly has like humor is in the forefront, but it's a pastiche, it's an homage. It's not like it's not a parody. It is actual like fantasy novels that also then like makes fun of the genre or, you know, draws humor from the limitations or flaws or whatever. And so an RPG generally is going to have like rule sets and expectations, especially a TTRPG. There's multiple people playing together. And so I can imagine a version of it that would be really enjoyable and humorous to play, but it seems like it would be really tricky to nail like the whole point of subverting expectations and flouting tropes and whatever in an RPG format. Seems like it would be very difficult. Seems I would be concerned that it ended up just getting kind of played straight, you know, like ignoring the subversive humor of it. It would be like playing a Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, I think is the best equivalent to Discworld, where it's also just satire, satirical humor. It's entirely about Earth and people on Earth in what it's addressing or exploring, but it does it through being able to, you know, like the opening action in Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy is Arthur Dent, the hero of our story, whatever. He's woken up by a bulldozer showing up at his house one morning because they're going to knock it over because they're building a new highway there. And he's complaining about like, why wasn't I notified about this? And saying, you know, we did notify you. And then of course it's in like ridiculous ways that no one would ever know. And in order to try and challenge something, you have to go through these, it's a bypass. Yeah. Go through all like absurd, you know, down to the second sub basement and talk to the woman whose door says like, caution man-eating leopards or something like that. And then while he's doing that, while that's happening, the Earth gets destroyed by an alien species that like they've shown up as the equivalent of a bulldozer, and we're building like a intergalactic or interstellar bypass. Like, well, you were all notified about this, right? So like obviously right from the jump making it clear that we're using like sci-fi and fantasy and whatever in order to make commentary on real things. And that would also be a very strange, like those are the kinds of RPGs that to me would have to be a one shot almost, like one shots seem better suited to subversive humor. You've got to build bypasses, said in the construction person's voice. Yeah. Both of those series, by the way, amazing, hilarious, genius series. Discworld and Hitchhiker's Guide. They both also fall off later on, but even the later stuff I still think is worthwhile. Discworld is way bigger. So I don't know, 40, 50 some books. Anyway, talking about all kinds of things today. I think we've talked about this on the stream before, but what people want is to be surprised but not fooled. And obviously that's like a very tricky, it's not really a line so much, right? Like what one person thinks of as like, ooh, I was surprised. Another person's, like, hey, that was dirty pool. Mysteries, for example, there's a concept in mysteries called fair play. That's what you're referencing there, Bast Insider, is that a fair play mystery is one where like the audience has access to all the information necessary to solve the case before the solution is presented to them. One in which like, the criminal was somebody that you never heard of before in the narrative is not a fair play mystery. You couldn't have solved that, right? Aaron M. Evans always says people like to be surprised. They don't like to be tricked. Yeah. Maybe I heard that from you before. But yeah, no, another way of saying this that often is relevant in the work that I do is people love to learn. People hate to realize that they don't know. And like, in order to learn, you have to, that indicates that there's something you didn't know, something that you were wrong about. So there's an art to like how this stuff is presented. I can get on board with a violent action movie for sure. But depending on how it's presented, like if you present it differently, no, I'm going to hate it and refuse. And so that's what we're talking about, whether it's that, whether it's humor, whether it's like real life expectations. We want people and things, everything, to divert from our expectations, but only in ways that we like. And of course, right, we're talking about what we like. We like it when things are different and unanticipatable is the word I'm wanting to say, but that's not the right word. Whatever. We like it when things like change up and we can't just predict everything all the time. And we like it when things that we like happen. If it changes up, we like that. But if it changes up and the result of that change up or what's happening is something we don't like that. So yeah, if you tell me, I'm trying to pick the first thing that popped in my mind was like people will sometimes make agreements like, okay, I'm only going to spend $20 on your gift, and then they spend a lot more. Sometimes people are delighted by that surprise. Sometimes people are angry and feel tricked or misled. Yeah, I struggle a lot with wanting a lot of sincerity from stories. See, for me, what I want is a sincere attempt to accomplish what they're trying to accomplish. That like acknowledge what you are, what you're doing, what you want to be, what your value is, because that allows you to like maximize it, right? If when I was younger, I don't much like these kinds of movies these days, maybe again in the future, but when I was younger, I loved movies that were like very deep character explorations and that were really complex and kind of gross, and that made by the end of the movie I felt like, oh, it's like humans are gross. Everything is awful and people suck and whatever. I also loved movies like, I'm trying to think of things that like, what are some things that I really like okay. I really like the Star Wars prequels, even though that's something that the general consensus is that they suck. I think that they accomplish what they're trying to accomplish really well. I just think that a lot of the audience that went and was excited about those things was anticipating something other than what they ended up getting. Because what the prequels do is very different from what the original series trilogy does. People tend to want and identify more with sardonic humor and people acting badly to others because it's realistic or fits with their vision of the world as that kind of place. And then you get flashes of sincerity and warmth sprinkled in. Yeah, there definitely is. People sometimes arrive at this idea that real art is painful, that like anything which is pleasant or enjoyable isn't as artistically valuable as things which are uncomfortable, which I think is understandable but absurd. I usually want people to be sincere and trying their best most of the time with maybe flashes of failing. I got to get wrapping up, but look, there's a reason narrative and art, like, well, let's focus on narrative because we're talking about narratives specifically right now. Not all art is narrative, but we're talking about narrative art forms. But this is true of all art. Narratives are not intended to be like accurate reflections of reality. They would serve no purpose if that's what they were, right? Like even a reality show or whatever, nobody's wanting to like even the person you love most in the world, you know, my spouse, my wife, at the end of the day, like I want to know about what happened in her day. I don't want to like observe everything that happened in her day 1 second to 1 second and just follow her around and have no experiences of my own, right? We want narratives presented to us that like highlight certain things and leave out other things. Very different end of the spectrum than most people I talk to are usually interested in. Yeah, well, so narrative is not meant to present things accurately. It's meant to present things in ways that are useful. We could also say interesting, but the reason theoretically that we've kind of socially and whatever evolved over the millennia, centuries, whatever, to find things interesting which are in some way useful, that they allow us to explore things, learn things, attempt things, experience things that are useful to us to experience in that way as opposed to in real life. There's catharsis goes into this and whatever, but sometimes people get the misconception that like, because we were talking earlier about suspension of disbelief, there's a term verisimilitude, which is like how realistic or how lifelike or true to reality something is. The greater the verisimilitude, the easier it is to suspend disbelief. You know, like a gritty character drama or a kitchen sink drama, those are very realistic compared to a space opera, right? And sometimes, especially in our culture, people tend to focus in on like what makes something great is that it's realistic, but that's not, nothing is realistic and nobody would want anything realistic. They're just talking about verisimilitude, things which require less. Game of Thrones is an example where George R. R. Martin specifically wrote Game of Thrones. He stated as a response to Lord of the Rings that he didn't like that in Lord of the Rings, good triumphs over evil. He said that does not match reality. That's not how things work out in the real world. And it's kind of this fake, you know, schmaltzy pap, you know, and he wanted to write something where it went like how things go in the real world. Obviously, that's a very cynical worldview to think that like, no, the bad guys always win and everybody's terrible and evil all the time. And that shows through in his writing. Not to say that I don't enjoy those books or that show, because I do, but to have such a strong reaction to the idea that good might triumph over evil, which, by the way, I also think is a big misreading of what Lord of the Rings is doing and what Tolkien is doing, but whatever. To have such a strong reaction to that, even if you think that, like, it's one thing to be like, oh, okay, whatever. It's another to be like, no, I have to write something to compete with this and be the opposite. Although it's interesting that he can't finish it because that's not how real life works. Anyway, It's a cynical worldview, and people get to these cynical worldviews for a reason, and then they want to see their experiences reflected. But more often, it's actually they want to see their beliefs reflected in the art. They're looking for art that, well, what they're saying is that art should be something that makes people uncomfortable and challenges them. They mean other people. Art should make other people uncomfortable and challenge them, not me. Like, I have the right ideas about what art is supposed to be, and art should be what I want it to be. Yeah, Tolkien definitely does not write that good triumphing is inevitable. Yeah, definitely. Also, even to sum up the narrative of the Lord of the Rings as good having won is like questionable. Anyway, I mean, good wins. I'm not saying that it doesn't, but it's more. All right. Genre fiction tends to get dismissed in serious conversations because it is accessible, because it matches, it shares certain characteristics and aesthetics with stuff that is meant for kids. And fairy tales, fables, things like that. And so it often gets dismissed as being childish. Comics are dismissed originally in part because like there's fewer words and a lot more images, which is again something that people culturally think of as like children's media, as though creating and then interpreting visual information is not as valid as textual information or whatever. I'm reading the books for the first time now, and there's constant talk about even if we win, so much that is good will have been lost. Yeah, I mean, look, Tolkien himself said that The Lord of the Rings was not an allegory. Many, many, many people, almost everybody, treats it as an allegory, including various like serious scholars of Tolkien will still say that it's an allegory. There's conversation to be had about to what extent is the allegorical nature like something that he wasn't aware of or intending. Did he mean to make it an allegory, or did it just kind of end up happening? But I think a different way of exploring that is to say that humans make meaning and find patterns. And so if you present to me something of interest, I'm going to connect it to other real things that matter. Otherwise, I wouldn't find it to be interesting. When I'm saying what I think Lord of the Rings, I think Lord of the Rings is a celebration of narrative. If you want to like put on like what it's attempting to accomplish, it itself, it's a narrative about. It's not about, but like it's a celebration of narrative, of stories, not with a point to it, just that they exist and they're great. It's great that they exist. But if you want to like look at putting some interpretation on it, then like I think the most valid theme you can point to there is about the balance between progress and grief, right? That like for new things to happen, old things have to end. And I actually think it like the narrative certainly seems to skew heavily towards, that's really sad, sad that old things end. But I say it seems to skew that way because like that's what everybody's focused on and talking about. But that's, I think, very true to how things work, right? Like when we know something and we lose it, we're very aware of the elements of it that we knew and liked that we're losing. When there's something new coming, we don't know what it is, and we don't know what we're going to like about it yet. But yeah, I mean, that's the whole thing is like the end of one age and the start of another, elves leaving and new kingdoms arising and whatever. Honestly, I think like there's an interpretation of the Lord of the Rings in which you could argue that Sauron and like the various things associated with him are irrelevant window dressing. That like the narrative, in order for the narrative to function as it does, needs to have like this powerful artifact that is tempting but must be destroyed. And in order to kind of like explain that, you need some reasoning behind that, and Sauron being that reasoning. And then also you need trials to overcome, and Sauron being those trials. But like for the most part, if you could read or watch Lord of the Rings, pretend that Sauron isn't even real, pretend that like everybody is wrong, he doesn't actually exist, and notice that nothing changes about anything, right? Like, anyway, I'm getting too into the weeds about. I'm not into the weeds. I like talking about this, but I do got to get wrapped up, moving on to other things. I think you want to like identify. We're talking about this from two ends. On the audience end, the consumer end, you want to identify what kind of an experience is it that you're looking to have, and then select from among the options that are presented to you in order to be able to like optimize your chances that engaging with that will be the experience that you are looking for. And sometimes people are looking for experiences in which they are made uncomfortable or sad. On the artist end, I think it's about being as clear as you can be and to yourself about what experience it is that you are offering to people, or at least attempting to offer. Acknowledge it and lean into it. That, I know this is an over-referenced quote, but George Lucas talked about the prequel, Star Wars prequel trilogy being something that he made for his kids. And like, yeah, there's obviously truth to that, and it's way better for kids. It's amazing for kids, but I think there's a lot more value to it than just that. And if there wasn't, that's okay too. Lots of stuff that is for kids is inherently also awesome. I want to say so many things. When you're offering things to people, when you're trying to figure out who you are and what you're doing and how it's valuable and like trying to accomplish the things you want to accomplish, it is really useful, I would say really important even, to understand what it is, understand and acknowledge what you are, what it is that you do, what it is that you're offering, so that you can lean into accomplishing it as well as possible, right? Like you can be the best version of who you are that there is, or you can be a mediocre version of what everybody else is, right? And when people get embarrassed or feel ashamed about like what they are or what they offer, I think that's genuinely sad. Like, not all art is something that I am interested in or looking for. I don't think any of it should be embarrassed about what it is. I guess maybe any is a broad brush or whatever, but like, I'm talking broadly here. You don't want to approach your own art one step removed, at arm's length. You don't want to live your life with an ironic detachment from who you are. And you don't want to write your book or make your movie or with an ironic detachment from what it is that you're creating. That's what I think. I'm saying what I want look for in sincerity is people who are entirely sincere and enthusiastic about what it is that they're doing. Some people probably should. Yeah, I can definitely see that. Some people probably should be embarrassed about their opinions, but generally, yes. Right. That's why I like step back there, because I'm sure there are some things that are art that like I would be like, no, people should be embarrassed about what they're trying to accomplish. Yeah, that's really important to me. Like this idea that there's one right way to be is of course absurd. And like we all generally understand that in our culture, at least in when it's phrased that way, that there's not just one right way to be, a right kind of person or whatever. There's different things. But we haven't fully identified and gotten rid of all the effects of that belief in everything that we do. And art is one where it comes up a lot, like people thinking about like this is good art or bad art in some general way, as opposed to like what is it trying to accomplish and does it accomplish that well. I think there is skillful or artful efforts, applications, pieces, but the question is it accomplishing what it's trying to accomplish, not does it match some externally set criteria for what something like it should be. Maybe it's just my own bias, but that's what I love about Name of the Wind. It feels wholehearted and sincere to me. I agree. In fact, I would put Name of the Wind similarly to Lord of the Rings, where it's like a celebration of narrative, except I would say that I think, and I would bet that this has something to do with the difficulty in finishing the series, is that once again, there's like a cynical bent to it, right? Like that it's being presented as a narrative in the way that like Lord of the Rings is a celebration of narratives or whatever, but it's being presented in a frame story structure where like there's this meta commentary in the frame that like the narrative itself is flawed or falls short in some way, which is like deeply sad. I think Name of the Wind is so beautiful. Primarily, the prose is just phenomenal. Like the actual language that is used is just gorgeous. But the narrative structure and the pacing and the flow is all very like so pretty and sad, like sadly beautiful, right? I Maybe it feels that way because it matches with my existing conceptions, but I love how the people feel so alive to me. I agree. Well, I agree. I think that the characters feel very fleshed out. Um, I like that it's kind of a take on the mystery box structure where, like, because of the frame of the story, it's set up that, like, there's something going on and we don't know what it is yet. And maybe we'll find a little pieces out as we go along. But then the bulk of each book is just the narrative being presented. Again, I'm assuming that has something to do with the difficulty in finishing it, but I could be wrong. Who knows? Um, the like the narrative itself is presented kind of without comment or purpose or structure. Like it's a book where like something happens and then something happens and then something happens and then something happens. It's hard to identify like here's the arc and here's the climax and it's just like an ongoing story. Yeah, it has a real autumnal vibe to it in general. Yeah. Um, Look, I'll say this. When you gaze too long into the abyss gazes also into you, something like that. I forget the exact quote. He who fights monsters should take care to see to it that he himself does not become a monster, something like that. Those kinds of quotes. I think art, one of the things about art that is particularly, when there's a piece of art that is particularly powerful or moving or successful in what it's trying to accomplish, it tends to be immersive. Not always, but it tends to be very immersive. You really get wrapped up into it. Like the Broken Earth trilogy, man. By the end of that, I just like felt like I was feeling everything the characters were feeling. Um, and when what you're doing is exploring some very like dark and sad and painful and just disheartening things, I think I think artists need to be careful about the extent to which there are limits. Things impact us the way they impact us, and it's wonderful to create something like that where you're saying, I think it's useful for this to exist, to have this impact on people. But if that's your life day in, day out, day in, day out, like that's who you become. You start to feel and see those things in that way everywhere. Uh, there are there are ways to do that. There are examples of people who create very like dark and difficult art who are also very bright and happy people because of how they balance and structure their lives and engage with their art. But there are correlations and trends. People who tend to focus on creating that kind of art also tend to overly identify themselves with their art, and it can get mucky. So just art is just a thing. It's nothing. It's not your soul. It's not. I agree. I worry about only engaging with very cynical media. Yeah, being cynical and being accurate are not the same thing, but cynical people believe they are. That's what cynicism is. By definition, cynicism is like the belief that one's own pessimistic worldview is accurate. Otherwise, you'd call yourself a pessimist. Um, And while terrible things happen, good things happen too. And the ratio is, we can say very, very broadly, in the history of the human experience, the ratio is very strongly tilted towards good and beneficial things happening at a higher rate. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here as a species. Like we wouldn't be growing. There's all kinds of terrible stuff too, but you don't have to act as though that's all of it, or even that that's the majority of it. In fact, we were starting to talk about this with narrative. Like that's part of what makes narrative useful, is that it's selecting uncommon things to present to people. If these things were common, you'd be seeing it all over the place all the time. But it's rare. It happens, but it's rare. And so it needs to be packaged into narrative for people to have any awareness of it. And there's a lot of utility, a lot of value in making people aware of difficult and unpleasant things that they otherwise wouldn't be aware of. But you want to balance that out in your work so that it doesn't just slowly eat away at you. And you want to balance it out in your work so that the audience is not just discouraged, but actually encouraged about taking action to make things better. I would say, again, I know other people have different opinions, and that some people would say, like, no, it's just about being sad about how everything's terrible and there's nothing you can do about it. I don't find that to be useful. We're living a life. Let's do something with that life, Anyway, we just don't pay attention to good things. That's definitely true and proven over and over, that we notice bad more than good by a lot. And we don't believe people are doing things with good intentions if we don't know them, so we assume good things are secretly bad. Yeah, there's a lot of that too. Cynicism, a lot of that is just like the result of being damaged. And like, it's good to be aware and supportive of the fact that people get damaged and that it has impacts on them. That's different from saying that the result of being damaged is actually a good thing that should be treated as a good thing, right? Like if somebody broke my leg, it's important that we're all like, well, that person broke my leg and that sucks. And, like you shouldn't feel bad about the fact that your leg is broken. But also, though, it sucks that your leg is broken, not like, and that's just a good way to be now, right? Anyway, I really got to go. Good to be with you all. Thank you, Bast Insider, for engaging with me in the chat today. I will be back same time next week. Be well.